thank you all. Welcome. We are thrilled to be talking to you about this really interesting topic today. We are going to be discussing the science behind brand mascots, brand characters, spokespeople, celebrities, and digging into what is it about them that works and what is really the secret sauce? How do we make them work even more effectively? My name is Spencer Gerrol. I'm the founder and CEO of Spark Neuro, and our mission is to be the world leader in practical applications of neuroscience and really taking the most sophisticated research out of academia and into practical application for advertising and entertainment. And that's what we do every day. And so with that, we are doing these monthly webinars, and some of you hopefully saw the last one as well. And this time, we're going to be talking about the following subjects. So first, we're going to dig into understanding, well, what is even the science behind brand characters? How does it work? What is happening psychologically? And then we're going to move into, well, what are the secret ingredients? Scientifically speaking, what has research been able to show us about when you're making a brand character, how do we really optimize that? How do we make sure that you're really making the best use of that opportunity? We'll then transition out of brand characters and into celebrities, actual people, famous people that can, if used in the right way, really support your brand and create even stronger brand affinity or memory or even purchasing behavior. But when does that work and when does that not work? And how do we really understand that better? And finally, we're going to be showing a few really exciting examples of this in action. So that's what we'll be covering today. And I'm really looking forward to digging in. And so let's just go right ahead and do so. We're going to begin by giving a couple examples of existing research that a lot of people are using to make decisions. And like any research, if it doesn't quite connect with your instincts and you have questions about it, you should trust your instincts and you should feel free to ask those questions and dig into, like, what was the methodology? And even when looking at our own research, I would encourage you, be very skeptical. Right? Ask us the hard questions. Of course, we won't have time to do that in this session because I'm more broadcasting than having a conversation, but always make sure that when talking to anybody presenting research that you approach it with a skeptical lens. I think it's always important to do that. And in the spirit of doing so, here is a study that was published in a major journal, Psychology and Marketing. And it's something that we've seen clients, we've seen people use this research actively. But let's take a look at the research. Now, the research was looking for brand personification through the use of spokespeople. And it was asking the question, if you are using spokespeople in your advertising, what's better? Should you use employees? Should you use actually the CEO or the figurehead of the company? Should you use celebrities? What is actually going to have the greatest impact on creating better brand affinity for your products? And this study came out and said, well, it turns out that CEOs are the best, and brands should be using their CEO as their spokesperson for their advertising. And it also came out and said, celebrities have no impact. Celebrities shouldn't really be used as the spokespeople for the advertising. And ordinary employees sort of came out in between. So does this sit right with you, or does something seem a little off? Does it really consistent with what you've seen in the real world? Well, let's look at the methodology. The methodology for this study, even though we've seen companies go down the path of following this advice, was a focus group of 4 people. And if you think about the context of a focus group, you have a group of people who may want to believe about themselves that celebrities don't affect them, they're above that. But in reality, what's happening subconsciously may be very different than what they want to report in a group of people. And they may say, actually, the CEO is the important figurehead that we really want to learn from and hear from. But when we've seen brands try that approach, unless the CEO is incredibly charismatic, we've seen it very, very much fall flat. And so we should be questioning this research. And the idea that this was a 4-person focus group is not enough to fully answer the question. Let's take a look at another study. This study constructed a model, and this was a survey methodology. They surveyed 144 students to see what best evokes character trust, and therefore better attitudes towards the brand. And they looked at nostalgia. They looked at, does the character show an expertise? And they looked at, is the character in some way relevant to the brand? And which of these figures, which of these elements would do the best job at evoking trust? Now, let's again dig into the methodology. So the construct is really quite interesting. The first thing that we want to question is character nostalgia. Now, with character nostalgia, if you have a brand mascot that's been around for 20, 30, 50 years, well, then that nostalgia may be very well embedded. But if you're now creating a new character, you don't have the opportunity for nostalgia. It takes years and often decades to really create that long-lasting nostalgic feeling toward a character. So that's something to just keep in mind as we look at the results of the study. The next question is on expertise. Are brand mascots really ever going to be experts? Celebrities might be, but is a gecko an expert in insurance? Is a duck an expert in a different kind of insurance? Is that even the right question to be asking? And moreover, this overall construct says that the thing that matters most is that mascots, their main purpose is to look at trust. And that trust is the key thing that mascots really need to evoke. Well, there are plenty of people who would argue that, in fact, relevance in and of itself is actually the goal. And being relevant and being memorable is really what we need the job of the mascot or the character to do. And so the study said that nostalgia and expertise were the most important things and relevance was not important. But we want to question that. And let's take a look at a couple examples. So is the gecko an expert in insurance? No. By nature, a gecko is not an expert in insurance. Is the gecko somehow memorable or relevant to the brand? Well, certainly just by the mere GEICO, gecko, GEICO, gecko, it becomes intrinsically linked. And it's hard to even separate them. And sometimes when I try to say GEICO, I accidentally say gecko. And that may even happen later in the presentation. And so that allows me to create a strong linkage between the character, making it absolutely relevant to the brand. How did Aflac do that? Aflac gave the duck a voice, and he says, Aflac, in kind of like a quack kind of way. And that embeds in your memory, and again, allows you to remember the brand and be able to distinguish it from any other insurance company. The Pillsbury Doughboy is absolutely relevant. It actually embodies in and of itself the product that they sell. And so relevance really is a critical factor. And so perhaps the study that we just reviewed, where they said that expertise is the most important thing, well, if you ask people, is it important that the mascot is an expert? Self-report, you might say, well, yes, the mascot should be an expert. But is that actually realistic? And is that really what we should be focusing on? Alternatively, is relevance and being able to embody and evoke memory really the important thing? Okay, so that goes into a lot of some of the traditional methods, which are important, right? Surveys, qualitative information, all very important. What we do at Spark is we also tap right into the source. So we're measuring brain activity through EEG, facial coding to see microfacial expressions, galvanic skin response, eye tracking, subconscious movements of the mouse as people are answering questions. And this holistic approach allows us to really dig in and see on a subconscious level, regardless of what people say about celebrities. Are they important? Are they not important? what is happening subconsciously and how is that really impacting the brand? And so it allows us to delve into a whole new layer. We'll talk more about this later, but essentially we're scanning people's brains and other aspects of their nervous system in order to get a better read on these critical and often subconscious emotional triggers that are really hard to describe in the context of self-report. One of the tools that we use is called Subconscious Influence Meter. This is a tool that allows us to look at not just the conscious choice that people make in a survey, but also what is their subconscious decision-making process. And we use this in order to evaluate the effect of brand mascots. So before I present the results, I want to explain how this tool works. You, as a participant, would be tasked with clicking that start button. And then you have a fraction of a second, usually 200 or 300 milliseconds, as fast as I can snap my finger to start making a choice. And because you're pressured to make a decision incredibly quickly, you begin to make that choice without your conscious mind really being fully active yet. You start with that subconscious decision-making process. So if we imagine a scenario where Verizon and T-Mobile are up against each other, we are looking at the effect of how people respond. So you click the start button and then people select Verizon. And then let's imagine a scenario where T-Mobile is really pushing a new ad campaign, like the one that they did for the Super Bowl. And we ask the question again. So that ad campaign has been out for a while and we ask the question again. We say, what do you choose, Verizon or T-Mobile? And the answer, well, it was still Verizon. So what happened? Did we change anything? Well, according to their conscious response, we didn't make a change at all. They chose Verizon before, they chose Verizon now. But is it realistic to think that one advertisement or one campaign is going to completely change how people interact with and what they choose around their brand decisions? And so what we're seeing here is that if people are making a straight line towards Verizon, that means they're expressing a great degree of confidence that that is their choice. But if it's a wavy line and they're actually being pulled in the direction of T-Mobile, well, they may not have changed their mind yet, but subconsciously, without even their awareness, you're starting to be pulled in the direction of maybe I ought to consider T-Mobile. And we see that in the way that they are responding in their fast subconscious reactions. So this tool is really useful, and this is something that we use in order to understand more about mascots. So we'll be getting into that later. The way that we did that for mascots is we had two conditions. In one condition, we just said, here's the logo. For example, Mr. Clean. Do you like the brand or do you not like the brand? And we tracked what did they choose and also what was the pathway subconsciously, how confident were they in that decision. And in another condition, we showed them, we primed them by showing, oh, Mr. Clean, the actual figure, Mr. Clean, just for a split second. And then how much do you like or dislike Mr. Clean? And that priming, we wanted to see, did that have effect? Did showing the mascot actually change people's answers, or at least the subconscious nature of how they made those answers? And that's something that we're going to report on the data later in the webinar. So let's get into the meat of it. What really are the secret ingredients? When you're creating a brand character, how do you do so as effectively as possible? So we're going to start with, we have a few lessons to teach. We're going to start with one that I think is really enjoyable. And so I'm going to play a little video for you, and then we're going to talk about it.
Alan! 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 Ow! Alan!
She's all neck and legs. Look at her.
Oh, I am looking at her.
Stop looking at her.
You just told me to look at her.
Ow!
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 Ow! That's right, me throat, that. John, I don't think we're allowed to.
Okay.
Alan!
And so on. So usually when I show that in a big crowd, there's just a ton of laughter in the audience, right? You have this hedgehog who has a voice and he's saying, Alan, Alan, and people really enjoy it. But why is that enjoyable? Why is that something that human beings really like? Because those videos went incredibly viral. It started in the UK, and it even spread over the pond and became viral in the US as well. And so what's going on here? This is something called anthropomorphism. People have this innate desire to actually humanize non-human characters. So whether it's an animal, a stuffed animal, anthropomorphism is something very important to people. And so you may find that you're doing this yourself all the time. If you have a pet, do you give your pet a voice? Most people wouldn't want to admit it, but in the privacy of your own home, you have a special voice that you give to your pet. For your car or some other item that you really have a lot of value on, did you give it a name? A lot of people do. So this is a very human desire. And why is that? Well, it comes from a couple key factors. First of all, we understand human beings better than we understand anything else. It's who we are. It's what we know. And so when it comes to describing, explaining, helping people learn or remember, giving things a human-like form is allowing us to really understand better these inanimate objects, brands, your car, your pet, and so you really want to humanize it for those reasons. Additionally, it is intrinsic to who we are as human beings to care about social connections. And so in order to create social connections and bonds, we want to humanize things. And brands leverage that. They try to create social connections and bonds by making human-like figures that people can connect with so they have greater affinity and greater emotional attachment to a given brand. So how does this work? How does anthropomorphizing, how does making something human-like, how does it really work, and what is the science behind it? Well, the first thing that we want to get into is the importance of movement as part of this process. So movement is really a critical aspect to how do you make something really human-like. In this experiment, they have this blob going through the streets, eating cars, and they conducted the experiment where the blob moved at 3 different speeds. Either it moved much slower than the other human passerbys walking around, so it was moving at a very slow speed, or it was moving at a really fast speed that was not at all the speed of the other humans that were in the scene, or it was moving at a very human-like speed. And the question was, at what point did people actually ascribe a mind, an intention, to this random blob that's going through the streets? It's a really funny study, but the results are incredibly interesting. So when it was moving really slow or really fast, people consider it to be just this random blob with no intention, just sort of like swallowing up cars as it passes by for no apparent reason. But when it was moving at that human-like pace, suddenly, just by the speed of it, they said this blob is evil. It has a mind of its own, and it has intentions, and when it's eating the cars, it means to do so out of malicious intent. And so suddenly we see that movement is actually a key characteristic in how you humanize or how you anthropomorphize. And brands need to use this to your advantage. So here's an example from Heathrow Airport, and they have these teddy bears. And I know the video may be choppy over a screen share, but these teddy bears, really, they do an amazing job of making sure that they move in a very human-like fashion. And part of the story is tracking these teddy bears as they age and as their relationship evolves. And you see, as time goes by, that they actually start moving more slowly. They're limping a little bit. And that gives them heart, that gives them soul and character, and it allows you to connect with the story more because the movement is absolutely a critical part of that story. Speaking of movement, what about when it's not even an animate object at all? It's not an animal, it's not a stuffed animal, it's something that's completely inanimate, like a lamp. Well, movement there is even more important because pretty much all you have in order to be able to humanize it. So let's take a look, for example, at the Pixar lamp. It hops around, it you know, it looks like a cute little kid, and it's jumping, and it kind of turns its face towards you and looks at you. And so Pixar has taken something which has no human characteristics at all, and just through movement has given it an emotional connection. It's given it a spirit that you could really understand with and admire. And so that is a really amazing strategy, using movement in order to help anthropomorphize. And we see that this has a really strong effect. In the study that I described before, where we said, how much extra lift, right? So this isn't not how much people like a brand or don't like a brand. How much extra lift is given when you prime people by seeing this, this character or mascot. And Pixar, for example, got a significant bump when people saw it primed by the lamp, as opposed to just seeing the brand alone. And so the strategies in general are working, and it's just working at different degrees for different brands. So that's one element, is movement. What about physical similarities to human form? How does that work? It's actually really an interesting topic, because the answer is a bit complex. So let's start out with the simple part. Some characters already innately look more human. So if you were to compare, for example, in this study, a lion to a bear has a better ability to be humanized. It's able to stand on two legs. It has a face that looks a little bit more human. And so people do have an easier time seeing that transition into like a cartoon character. And so it's easier to anthropomorphize certain things, and therefore more accepted and more desired to see those characters be humanized in their physical form. So how does this apply to the real world? Well, if you look at this duck, if you look at this gecko, which one actually has an easier ability to humanize? And you're probably thinking, well, the gecko. It has a mouth, not a beak. It has hands, not wings. And so it's easier to humanize. And so that's exactly what GEICO has done, right? They've actually really gone all in on humanizing the gecko. And I'll just play a little bit of this ad, but they humanized it to the point where it is absolutely, it speaks like a human, it moves like a human, it has emotions like a human.
I read this week, Joy, telling people that GEICO's been offering savings for over 75 years. That's longer than the buffalo wing's been around.
Dozen wings.
And did you know that GEICO offers motorcycle insurance?
See, he's even coughing and, you know, really showing that, oh, they reacted that the food was so spicy. So they really went for human. Now, we talked about how if something doesn't naturally lend itself towards being human, then it doesn't work as successfully when you try really hard to humanize it. And so you have to use different strategies. You can't make it physically similar to a human. And so Aflac has done exactly that. They didn't make an attempt to overly humanize the duck. In fact, they left it more in its duck form. And instead, in order to humanize it, they gave it a headset. They sat it at a desk. They have its wings sort of silly flopping around on the keyboard. And those elements are really the strategies that were necessary to be taken, because if they went too far in humanizing, it would not have been liked. It would have actually been less effective. So it was the right approach, and it's a different approach for different brands, different animals, different kinds of mascots. And we see that for both Aflac and for GEICO, there was a really big lift in the presence of the mascot compared to just looking at the brand alone. So again, this is not saying that Aflac ranked better than GEICO. It's saying that GEICO, which already is liked and had a high bar, was even more improved in the presence of the gecko. And Aflac, which started with a little bit of a lower bar, was really drastically improved in the presence of the Aflac duck. And so they are having a really strong effect, and they're done well. So we've talked about characters. We talked about movement, and how important movement is to making sure that you humanize something very well, and how to focus on that. We talked about how do you take non-humans and humanize them in the most effective way, understanding that they come with their different attributes. We even looked at inanimate objects, but what about when it comes to actually animating human figures in and of themselves, like, for example, the Colonel from KFC or Mr. Clean? Well, this is where it gets a little bit trickier. There's something called the uncanny valley. And in one of the experiments that studies the uncanny valley, they show this animation that you're seeing on your screen right now. And there's a certain point between doll and human where suddenly it actually gets kind of disgusting. It sort of grosses you out. And so that particular moment where suddenly it's just kind of gross is what's known as the uncanny valley. And this is how that works. We'll start by looking at the black line. So they did a study where they looked at human-like objects and made them either more or less human. And so the dark line is showing a human-like object, and as it progresses towards being more and more human, more and more familiar as human-like, it suddenly becomes very cute. It looks like a stuffed animal. But then it gets to a level, an amount of human that is suddenly in this awkward valley, the uncanny valley. And it no longer looks like a cute stuffed animal. Now it looks like a corpse, and it's disgusting, and people are actually repulsed by it. And then it crosses the chasm and comes out the other side. And the same goes for a moving object. Remember, we talked about how important movement is to anthropomorphizing. And so when you look at the dotted line, there's a point where it's an industrial robot, and then it looks like a humanoid robot, and then it gets into this chasm, and during that period, it's a zombie. It's repulsive. And then it crosses the chasm and looks like a healthy person. And so it's really interesting to understand, where does that chasm lie? So, you know, mistakes have been made. I mean, look at the figure on the left. Like, this is right smack in the middle of the uncanny valley. And despite their greatest attempts, this is a figure that actually repulsed people. And there's an interesting story of how this all works. It's not as simple as just taking one element or another. It actually has to do with how do the eyes, the mouth, the skin, how does it all interplay together? And at about the 65% mark is where you get to a point where it seems like an animate object, where it seems more human-like. Finding that point is incredibly important, because the last thing you want to do is repulse your audience. And there are many examples where brands have done this wrong because they didn't do the appropriate testing along the way, and many examples where it's been done beautifully well. One of the most famous examples, or one that I particularly like, is what Pixar did in 1999. Finally, the ability to animate got to a point where you could really make animations that were getting more and more and more human-like. And this Tin Toy film was absolutely critically acclaimed. And critics just absolutely loved it. And it won awards, and everyone was really, really excited about it. It actually came out in 1989. And when we look at the excitement of the critics because of the advancements of the technology, that's one side of the coin. But what about how people responded? Well, it turns out that people were really quite disgusted by it. And it ultimately was a failure. And the critics were wrong. It was a great advancement in technology, but it hit the uncanny valley and did a really poor job of doing something that really attracted people, that people couldn't even sit through the film. It was gross, for lack of a better word. And so Pixar, of course, they evolved, and they became so good that they even figured out how to put the right amount of, look at the picture on the right, liquid in the eye to reflect emotion. How do we get to the exact right side of the valley, whether on the left or on the right, so that we can really have something that is appealing and not disgusting? And it's a delicate line. And it's one that is really interesting to look into. So what have we gone over so far? We talked about some studies that were done that people based their research on or based their creative on that in some ways are a bit flawed and how to be careful of that. We talked about how to make the best use of a mascot, how movement plays into that, how the similarity to actual human form plays into that, how you can apply that to inanimate objects, how this uncanny valley of humanizing actually plays an important role in being successful. Well, what if we cross to the complete other side of the chasm and talk about real people, and in this case, celebrities? Well, there's a number of great studies, and this could be a webinar all of its own, but in the interest of time, we're just going to give you a sneak peek into some of the most profound studies that really help us understand what happens with celebrities. So, celebrities are used on all kinds of products, Nike, in this case, Smart Water, and they're used across brands. It's a strategy that has been seen as tried and true. There are interesting studies to try to uncover, well, what's really happening with celebrities, and is it really worth it? It's always a question that we get asked. And in this particular study, one of the first things that they did was they asked the respondents, is a celebrity going to affect your purchase intent? And the answer that people gave was no. A celebrity being in your advertisement is not going to affect my purchase intent. And they measured that like in a survey, nope, didn't affect purchase intent. So the scientists decided that it's time to study this a little bit deeper because we can't always trust what people say. And that's why Spark Neuro is here, because we want to measure brain activity in order to really understand what people feel. So the study showed just a celebrity alone, Julia Roberts, and this was at the time of the height of her career. And they showed Julia Roberts paired with a product, with a shoe, and they showed just a normal person paired with the product, with the shoe. And there are a couple really interesting things that came out of this. Despite the fact that people said that they really didn't care about a celebrity being a feature of the product, it turns out that there were some really important differences. One is that when put into an fMRI machine and they look at the celebrity alone, they look at a normal person with the shoe, and they look at the celebrity with the shoe, only in the condition where the celebrity was paired with the shoe did we see activation in the medial orbital frontal cortex. And that's an area of the brain that is consistent with ascribing value to things, showing that you really care and value something. And in addition to seeing major differences in the brain activity of pairing a celebrity with a product compared to a normal person, or just the celebrity alone, or just the product alone, we also saw that people remembered the product more later. And so even if people say that the celebrity is not having an effect, it's certainly measurably having an effect on their brain when paired with the product, and it's causing them behaviorally to remember it more later. So we get into some very interesting territory here. The next question that we need to ask is, well, how important is it that the celebrity is actually an expert in the thing that they're advertising? And what is the difference in brain activity and other behavioral metrics when people are paired, for example, Andre Agassi here with advertising a tennis racket versus advertising a beverage? Is there a difference, and does that matter, and if so, how much? So looking at the brain scans of when the celebrity was paired with something that they were an expert in, there were drastic differences. Now, in the interest of time, I won't get into the singular gyrus and the dorsal prefrontal cortex and so on and so forth, but needless to say, there was a major difference in brain activity when the celebrity was paired with something that they were an expert in. And not only was that difference in brain activity measurable, but it also showed that they had higher recall and higher recognition for the brands that were paired with the celebrity who was an expert at that thing that they were advertising. So it matters, and it matters regardless of what people say. Now, interestingly, these studies can be really expensive, and they can be really complex. This is what an fMRI machine looks like. It costs nearly $6 million. It takes a full-time staff to run it. And you can only go through a certain number of subjects because it's a time-consuming process. And so it's not completely practical or realistic. But it is the foundation of a lot of the science that we use here in our lab at Spark Neuro. And so now what we've done is we've created the ability to really scale that up and scan brain activity and other neurological and biometric responses in order to be able to measure these same sorts of things. And finally, we're going to leave you with an example of that in action. So we studied, we've studied thousands and thousands and thousands of ads. And we took a look at which ones had celebrities, which ones didn't, and when were there differences in how celebrities performed. And one thing that, again, we just sort of note is that we started these studies by saying, hey, according to your self-report survey, what is most important to you when it comes to what's in advertising? And almost 70% of people said that a celebrity was absolutely the least important thing. So we're seeing a lot of consistency here across various studies, including Spark Neuro research. However, when you look at, for example, this 2018 Super Bowl ad for Amazon's Alexa, we see all of these spikes of engagement. And these spikes of engagement where we are measuring direct from the source, direct from brain activity, are consistent with the appearance of these celebrities. So, when we go through this ad, you see that, that we have these amazing spikes where people get emotionally engaged. That's the red line. They actually pay much more attention. That's the green line, especially during moments when celebrities are present. But it's not just the presence of the celebrity. It's the way that the celebrity behaves and how it's integrated into the story. So you see a spike here because this celebrity, he's being himself. Gordon Ramsay is cursing and really absolutely being himself. And Cardi B is absolutely playing her character. And it's creating a really strong connection. Not only that, but and of course, we have this really big spike when we get into this next moment here. But these characters are really embodying who they are, and they're integrating with the story of the product. In this story, Alexa loses her voice, and the celebrities become Alexa. That is an absolutely powerful way to integrate the celebrities with the story. Alternatively, same Super Bowl 2018, they used celebrities and tried to integrate that into Pepsi and see how effective that was. Now, there's a big difference between using a celebrity to be its true character and that all of that personality out versus kind of throwing a celebrity in a way that doesn't perfectly integrate with the story, and that doesn't create the same kinds of spikes. So what we see here is that we're not seeing the same kind of spike when the celebrity is just thrown in as opposed to being fully integrated part of the story and connected with the product. Now, there's a lot of nuance to that, and there's a lot of different angles for how we ensure that's done right, but the key thing is that we can measure it, and measuring that emotional response is really critical. When it comes to mascots, we'll end on one final example, and it's an example that is one of the better performing Super Bowl ads we've ever seen. So you see that attention here never drops below 5. It stays incredibly high the whole time. And this ad performed incredibly well in every metric. And we were able to see that because it was something that absolutely captivated attention. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you left it to focus groups alone, this particular ad had some issues. A group of men all together watching this ad with a message of, you gotta love a man who cleans, and showing a sexy guy dancing around cleaning. Well, men in a group, all it took was one person to say, wait a minute, I don't like that message. You gotta love a man who cleans. I don't wanna see the sexy guy dancing around. However, with the methodology where we're actually looking at the brain activity of Ben, we saw they were incredibly engaged. And when we asked them one-on-one, because we do the qualitative part as well, how did you respond to this? One-on-one, without all the biases of the group, people say, yeah, I really loved that ad. And so by digging into their brain activity and being able to match that with all of these other more holistic variables, we can see that this is and should be a really phenomenally performing ad. So we covered quite a bit. We covered some of the drawbacks of some traditional research and how to mix it with more modern research. We talked about humans' desire to anthropomorphize, how to animate, how to integrate celebrities, and understanding true reactions based on new advancements in technology and research. So with that, we are at about 15 minutes left, and I wanted to take a moment to open it up for questions. And I'm going to get to the questions area, and this is an opportunity for everyone to just start throwing questions in. If you have any questions, feel free. For those of you that don't have questions and are ready to jump off to your next meeting, I'm so glad that you jumped it, that you were part of this, and that you got to see some of the science behind how mascots and celebrities really work. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned from it. So thank you very much. I see some people raising their hands. You should be able to just put a question in. And I see a question. What kind of eye tracking and face expression software are you using? Is it owned by Spark Neuro? So thank you, Becky. I really appreciate the question. Everything that we do at Spark Neuro is our own proprietary algorithms. So we're not using somebody else's software for how we analyze brain activity data or how we understand eye tracking. We're using Spark's proprietary algorithms, which spent years developing and continue through machine learning and really advanced technological changes, are continuing to get better and better and better all the time. So we are using, however, third-party hardware. So we're using different EEGs, different galvanic skin response devices, different eye tracking hardware. So we don't make our own hardware, but the actual analysis of the data is something that we feel that we need to own, because we need to make sure that what we're reporting on is absolutely accurate in terms of people's emotion and attention levels. So thank you for the question. Okay, more questions coming in. So what are thoughts on spokespeople who are neither anthropomorphism, right? They're not mascots or celebrities. Thank you, Tyler. So they're not like stuffed animals. They're not mascots. They're also not celebrities. They can just be influencers or spokespeople, like the Sprint spokesperson, for example. Well, that actually is a phenomenal question, because it's actually the subject of one of our upcoming webinars. And there's a lot to say there. And there's a lot of research about non-celebrity people and how that impacts people's perception of a brand. And it's a very nuanced question. And so on the high level, I'll say this, it has a major effect. And I hate to give the cheesy answer, the one where I say it depends, because I hate that cop-out. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to use the cop-out, Tyler. When you use a non-celebrity spokesperson, there are cases where it flies and it does so well. And there are cases where it completely flops. And how you integrate that, how you use that, the creative strategy behind how you roll it out are all critical factors. So, the short answer is it can be incredibly effective. The longer answer is that it is something that is really quite nuanced and needs to be done very well. The next question is very similar. So what about, for example, Flo from Progressive? Well, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been tracking over time. So Flo was a great success. For a period of time, Flo was performing incredibly well as a non-celebrity, non-mascot spokesperson for progressive. There was also a period where we start to see that decline, and we have some of our recent research showing some of that decline. And so, interestingly enough, this is not a one and done thing when it comes to spokespeople and even celebrities. It needs to evolve, and we need to constantly be on top of tracking how are these spokespeople performing over time, and are they continuing to be successful, or is there something that needs to change? And that doesn't necessarily mean changing the spokesperson. It might mean changing something about how you're using it. And you see progressives starting to do some of that in their more current and recent advertising. Karen, thank you. I appreciate the compliments. Have any examples and recommendations for static mascots, for example, in graphics? Is it worth using a long-established character on graphics for brands that do not spend money on advertising? You know, so I'm trying to infer some of the root of this question. So let's just take, for example, a cereal box. If there's a mascot that has an incredible nostalgic power and is something that continues to be relevant and something that people continue to emotionally connect with, even if it's not in a moving form and it's actually just printed on the box, that can be incredibly effective. Now, what needs to be done is we need to be able to measure the extent to which these characters are still having an impact just merely by their presence, or if there's something that has changed or worn off about them. And so there's always, I would recommend doing some amount of research in order to understand how a certain mascot is performing, so you know whether or not to integrate it, whether in a static form or in a moving form. And you know, the study that we presented where we showed people's mouse movements, right, and like how confident were they that they liked the brand and what was the impact of a celebrity, in that case, we actually used static mascots. And so we have some really interesting results to say, here are the cases where that static mascot created a really big lift. And there were also some cases where, in fact, it didn't create much of a lift. And there's something interesting. KFC, for example, we didn't see the same lift for the KFC mascot that we saw for some of the other ones. So there's something to look into there. Becky, thank you, very interested. Is it cloud-based, analyzing your data? So I'm so excited to have this conversation. Becky is really asking about how to work with us and how we work. I don't want to turn this into a sales pitch. I want to keep it very educational. So certainly we should have that conversation offline. But essentially, the answer is, sounds good, Becky says. So we'll have that conversation offline, but the general answer is that we've built some of the most complex algorithms that you can imagine. We are collecting 6,000 data points per second. We're processing it live so that you can actually see people's emotional responses. And we're, of course, doing it over a big enough sample size that the data is significant and meaningful. And one thing I want everyone to do, including Becky when we chat offline, is ask hard questions. Really get into the science of it. Say, how do your algorithms work? Because if you're talking to anybody in this arena, and we can't stand up to like, this is how our algorithms work. This is how we're applying machine learning. Here's how we control for noise. Here's what's statistically relevant. Those questions are critical because there's too much risk of pseudoscience when you're talking about things like applying neuroscience, which is one of the most complex things, and the human brain is one of the least understood things. And so I always want to encourage being skeptical of any research, including our own. So I look forward to that conversation. Tyler, I saw that you raised your hand. There was a little pop-up that said, Tyler's raising his hands. But what you can do is just enter a note in the Q&A section. And we have just about 5 minutes left, so I'll take a couple more questions. Sounds good. All right. Excellent. We have a question. Measuring attention versus emotion, and how does that affect engagement? So it's a great question. Thank you for asking. That's from Victoria. So how do we measure attention versus emotion, and what are those differences? So attention is something that you want to, in some ways, retain, and you want it to stay high, right? You especially want it to be high during key moments that are critical to the story being told, critical to the features or key benefits of what you're selling, and critical when the brand is present. So we want to see people paying cognitive attention, right? Not just looking with their eyes, but actually tuning in and listening with their brain to what you're saying. So attention is something that we're tracking, and I'll just pull up another graph. And we'll pull up the graph of Mr. Clean. And so when you see this graph, we say, wow, attention remains pretty high the whole time. It's just a 30-second ad. It's super engaging, and there's very little opportunity to lose attention. And we really want to see that. Now, that's a very high bar. It is very difficult to retain that level of attention in an advertisement for that long of a period. So we don't expect every ad to have that highest level of attention throughout, but it's certainly a goal. Emotion works a little bit differently. When it comes to emotion, the way that your brain is processing emotion is your brain is actually meant to control and modulate your own emotions. And so your brain is trying its hardest to keep you neutral. It's trying to keep you from freaking out. Otherwise, we'd all be laughing all the time or all be crying all the time. And so what your brain is trying to do is keep you down at neutral. But what the ad is trying to do, or what entertainment is trying to do, is push you out of that neutral zone. And so what we want to see is spikes of emotion. We want to see them happen frequently enough, and we want to see them retained at especially the most important parts. And we want to make sure that we're looking for where is emotion spiking, like what is causing that, and where are we actually getting people to neutral, and are we ever getting people to neutral for too long? And these things interact with each other. As you can see, when you see a big spike in emotion, it is often followed by a sustained and rise in attention. Because if you feel suddenly viscerally, emotionally excited about something, your brain kind of tunes back in and says, now I'm going to pay attention. And so if you're too neutral for too long, it will also predict that attention is going to fall off a cliff and you're not going to actually have people engaged over time. So it's the combination of attention and emotion that really contribute to engagement, both very important. All right, with that, I know that there are more questions, but in the interest of time and letting everyone get to their next meetings, which I'm sure everyone has busy days, we're going to wrap up, and I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. I hope that it was fun. I hope that you learned something, and we look forward to continuing the trend and teaching more as time goes by. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to hearing from you. Bye now. Oh, good. Thank you. I'm getting some nice comments in the questions. I do appreciate it. So I'm going to shut off the sharing for the moment. And again, thank you for attending, and feel free to reach out if you do have more questions that we didn't get to answer.